So since we have very limited time, I think we should now move on to the point number 3, incentive schemes and other deal terms. So Mitch-san, can I start with you at this point? In your presentation, I think you mentioned the importance of giving incentives to entrepreneurs, founders, or other key persons. Could you explore a bit more about how you can give incentives to those key persons? I think you mentioned earnouts and other concepts, but I would like to understand a bit more about how it would work in the body.
So it's depending on the case by case, but the many like we talk about the acquire or all those Google and those people buying the company left to right, they are buying talents, so they need an engineer team and they need a people. They don't need a venture capital. So what they gonna usually offer, they give us a good price, but usually we have to cover quite significant portion to the engineering or the management team, so that they'll be happy to sell and share and join the new company, the large company. So the signing bonus or the earnout or the retain, many cases there, but yeah. So this is my second time visiting Silicon Valley, and I was surprised to hear that in the morning I saw a lot of buses running from San Francisco to Sunnyvale towards that area, and Uber driver told me that they are employers prepare those buses for employees. And do you think those kind of nice food or transportation or table tennis or those kind of things matter? Or what are the how can you incentivize those employees? Is it money or the network that we can provide, or how could be the incentives for key persons? The money and the opportunity to play at a bigger level. So the startup is it could be a challenging, but it's quite fun too, because there's strong influence you can put it as an engineer to build a product. But there's certain limit that you can build because of limited resource in terms of cash. But if you join Google to do the same things, you can build a much more bigger impact to the market. So I think the impact to the market and obviously the cash come along with that.
That reminds me of a story. One day I was talking to a professor from the University of Tokyo. His major is robotics, and within his from his students, one of the students has established a company called Shaft. It's a robotic company, which was acquired by Google. I think it was last year or 2 years ago. And the professor mentioned that one of the reasons for the Japanese entrepreneurs was the environment that Google can provide or Google offered to those young Japanese entrepreneurs. They offered a good resources of networking. But maybe there was a big amount of money involved in the transaction, but as far as I understand from the professor, the big motivation for the entrepreneurs was that kind of environment or network towards the universe. So that's something I want to say. Dennis, can I ask you from a lawyer's perspective, but could you explain typical terms, deal terms that you can see from an entrepreneur?
Sure. I mean, cash is king of every time. So I think most entrepreneurs will want to get enough cash that they feel it's fair. Because any of these earnouts, any of these notes, or any deferred compensation or stock options in a public company, all of that in theory should be gravy or icing on the cake, because it may not happen. And if it doesn't happen, did you sell your company for enough money? I think the big challenge the buyer has is they're buying all this talent, and they need to keep that talent there. If they give them too much money up front, so they're all multi-millionaires, what motivation do they have to work for a 10,000 or 100,000 employee company? And that's the dilemma. Some of these engineers they're younger than us, believe it or not. You know, they're getting an incredible amount of money. And how do you make them stay around? Because you bought that talent, and you're going to redeploy them. They're not going to continue to work what they're working on. They're going to try to work on other stuff to really bright minds, and that's a big challenge. And so some of these deals, Google does it a lot. They'll give you a lot of cash up front, more than you think you would ever get. But they really tie a lot of that to performance, milestones and things in the future, a lot of stock options and things like that to keep these people motivated. But I do think some of these people are very smart, and they want that challenge, that intellectual challenge. It's not all about the money and the cars and the women. It's all about, you know, it's about that challenge and that next opportunity, and changing the world and things like that. And if they can get that culture in, then it works. But a lot of times these guys, you know, they were so nimble. If they wanted to make a change, the three of them get in the room and they decide. And now they get in this corporate culture, and they'd rather move to the beach or go somewhere else. And sometimes they don't last long, even with all these incentives, because they've been paid a lot of cash up front.
Sounds very tough.
Yeah, I know, exactly.
Chad, would you like to add something on that? Or?
No, I mean, the earnout is just a way to sort of bridge the difference of opinions, and it's also a way to retain talent. There's a couple ways to structure that we see. Some is tied to performance, some is tied to just tenure, like just how long you're going to be there. However you structure it, you want to make sure that it's going to kind of drive the desired result, and it's usually to retain talent. And the other thing is like the options. Sometimes you get a small company that's acquired and they get stock options, but it's stock options of a much bigger bloated animal that they're like, well, how is my performance here working on this thing? It might contribute to, you know, it's a blip in the size of this, you know, this monster. And so maybe that stock option is not going to be enough to incentivize them. So there's ways to devise plans that sort of are tied specifically to what they're working on. You can create sort of smaller LLCs with its own sort of stock in there, and therefore they want to feel empowered that what they're doing is going to drive their payout. And if you're working for a much larger company, they could come up with the best plan, the best idea, and the best technology, but and again, we keep on using Google as an example, but in Google might not even move the stock price, or there's something out of my control that will drive the stock price down. That's not fair to me as the engineer who's working on something else. So it's really important that the way you structure it achieves the desired result for the buyer. Ultimately, they're the ones who are paying the cash out, but also incentivizes and keeps the person who sold the company is now part of that ecosystem, keeps them motivated. And it's funny, you talk about all the perks around, the free lunches and the free commutes and whatnot. Silicon Valley it's more than a geography, it's a culture. And there's a Silicon Valley sprouting up everywhere across the country, and it is a culture. And you'll see them in places that you've never heard of before, like St. Louis, Missouri has a Silicon Valley, right? It's amazing. They're trying to sort of recreate sort of the atmosphere here. And now there's a challenge because, right, you can't replicate the weather. It's a challenge. But it's when I think of Silicon Valley, I don't think of a geography, I think of a culture.
Just one quick question. Has the St. Louis been successful so far?
Yeah, I mean, I'm from the Midwest and moving out here, but St. Louis is beginning to be a tech center, even in Chicago. But think about Chicago, a company like Groupon. Groupon was one of the fastest companies to $1 billion. Right, and it happened it took about 4 years for the company to go to $1 billion, and our minds were blown. This company went from nothing to $1 billion. It was a complete disruptor. It created a space, right? They were the kingmaker of that space. It happens every year, and it's not $1 billion. It's $3 billion or $5 billion. The speed, when we talk about it, the speed at which companies are growing is phenomenal. Now, some of these companies, these traditional companies that aren't tech companies, but harness the power of sort of the data analytics, the engineers, the programmers. So we talked about St. Louis. So I'll use the example of Monsanto. I know Monsanto is not everyone's favorite company, but Monsanto in St. Louis acquired the Climate Corp, which is a sort of a kind of a derivation of Google. It's a data analytics company for $1 billion. So how does a Monsanto, that sort of corporate culture, keep people who are sort of Silicon Valley-based developers and programmers, how do they keep them part of that company, right? And so it's a real struggle right now for sort of corporate America, who has to harness technology because it's such a disruptor, integrate them into their business model. And it's interesting to see. Sometimes it's like they will just create shell companies and keep them out here. You're not going to get a Stanford grad who wants to program to live in St. Louis. Right? It just won't happen. Yeah, so it just, you know, watching that dynamic play out is pretty interesting.
Right. Greg, would you like to add something from an IP perspective? Not just on the giving incentive, but other deal terms that are unique from an IP perspective?
I don't know if I'd say that there are terms that are unique. I guess what I'd say is with startups, even though you haven't been around a while, you haven't done that much, you would be surprised how easy it is for things to go awry. Meaning you didn't secure certain rights, or you did some things which in retrospect you probably ought not to have done. So I guess if you're working at a startup, these are things you want to avoid. If you're working at a big company thinking about buying a startup, these are things you want to look for to see if there's a problem, right? You want to make sure you understand what you're getting before you sign and buy that company, right?
Okay, so, since we touched a bit about IP aspects, shall we move on to point number 4, IP issues? Again, Greg, I think you, in your keynote presentations, you mentioned quickly a bit about common IP issues about in the transaction. Could you explore a bit more?
Sure. So I guess I break down the IP issues into 2 categories. One is inbound IP issues and one is outbound IP issues. So inbound IP issues are things that you have, things that you've created that's kind of proprietary to you. It may also be things where you're getting rights from a third party that's coming into your company. So you might be having tools, you might get IP from another company that you use as part of your product. So, you know, these are basically just some questions, you know, thinking about what do you have, how have you protected it, and what other IP are you using? Because you want to make sure that you're using IP from third parties, that you have all the rights you need to do what you're doing. So for example, and I guess we can kind of flip through next slide. These are some common IP issues. You know, things like ownership chain of title. You know, there's a bunch of people who created the IP, but you haven't secured all the rights from them, so there's a taint or a gap. IP protection. You know, have you appropriately protected the IP for your type of business? Now, there isn't a one-size-fits-all. It depends on the business. So, for example, if you're building a new type of laser, you probably want to get a patent. If you're a film company, you probably want to get copyright protection. So it depends on the nature of your business. You know, patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets. Lien and encumbrances is more just identifying issues that you want to be aware of. These are things like security interests and things of that type. Open source is also a common issue. Usually this is more relevant for software companies. And I guess the comment I want to make about open source is, even though you don't pay money for open source, it doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with it, and it doesn't mean that there are no conditions that come with it. So before you use it, you want to understand what effect that's going to have on your proprietary IP. And then the final one is third-party IP. So just making sure that what you're doing matches up with the rights you have. So for example, in some cases, people get a license to some IP for non-commercial purposes, and that's the limitation in the license, but they're using it for commercial purposes. They're making money from this thing. That could be a potential problem. Or licensing a component from a third party and then distributing that as part of your product, but not having distribution rights, as an example. So outbound IP issues are things that focus on what you've done with the IP. So you've developed this IP, now you're trying to build a business, you're trying to get customers, distribution partners. What have you done? You know, how have you used your IP and what have you signed up for? Next slide. And these are some common issues. Incompatible business models. So for example, you're a startup that gives software away for free and you charge based on accessories that go along with that software or services that you sell that go along with the software, but the acquirer who's interested in buying you, they charge money for their software. That might be a problem. Channel conflict. So this might be where the target has signed some type of exclusive arrangement in a particular geo, but the potential acquirer has signed a non-exclusive in that same geo. That could be a problem. Rights granted by the target or obligations that have been assumed by the target. So, for example, if you have some key technology to a potential acquirer, it may be a problem if you granted extensive rights to that acquirer's key competitor. Right? Because the people who want to buy you for a certain reason. Sometimes it's because they want to own that technology, right? And that means that they don't want others to have access to that technology. So some of the deals you've done could impact your desirability to a potential acquirer. In particular, if you granted extensive rights, the license is non-terminable and it's for a long time. And then I guess the final category would be potential liabilities. So this would be things like litigation or potential litigation, disputes, or things you've done that may otherwise subject you to liability. So if I'm the buyer, when I'm looking at a startup, I want to know what I'm getting in terms of technology, people, and what potential costs I'm picking up. So if I'm picking up a lawsuit as part of that deal, I want to know that in advance. I don't want to be surprised after the deal closes and we have this lawsuit. Oh, that's a problem, right? So.
And also, I think in your keynote presentation, you mentioned about large companies' point of view. Why large companies thinking about acquiring an early stage startup companies? Sometimes it could be the technology that the early stage companies have. And if that, in that case, I think you would have at least two options. One is to obviously acquire the company, but the other option would be to have a license agreement with the early stage startups. So what would be the key factors for large companies to think about those two options?
Right, so I think whether you want to buy it or whether you want to license it depends on what you're going to do with it. So for example, I'll use a house as an analogy. So if you want to just live in a house for a short term, maybe you can rent. But if you want to paint it purple, or if you want to knock down some walls, you're probably going to have to buy it. Because you can't rent a house and alter it in that fashion. So it depends on what you need it for, right? So if it's just something that is ancillary to your business, you're probably not going to buy that company, But if it's something that's core to your business and gives you a competitive advantage compared to competitors, maybe that's something that you want to own rather than just license.
Thank you. Dennis, on this slide, red slide, there are some things that could be covered by drafting.
Yeah, I like his earlier slide.
Yeah,
Can I talk about one of his earlier slides? Because one of the things that surprised me on ownership, that happens a lot, and people aren't focused on this sometimes. Brilliant scientist leaves Stanford or Caltech or whatever and starts a company, okay? Who owns that technology? Does Stanford still own it? Does Caltech still own it? I mean, do they have rights to it? I mean, where does that line stop? Was he doing the research while he was working at Stanford, or did he do it at nights and weekends on his own time? And so a lot of times you just think, well, I own it, I invented it. Well, not really. I mean, during your employment, you may have given rights to your university or your research where you started from. And a lot of times, the buyer wants to know that they're buying the technology. They want to make sure they own it. It also happens a lot of times when three founders, they're all good friends, they start the company, one of them leaves, and 2 years later, they never get him to sign anything. Did he assign his patent rights? Did he assign his intellectual property rights to the company? It's all that stuff documented. A lot of times, everyone's good friends, are moving really fast, they're bootstrapping, life is good, but those key ownership issues never get resolved, and then it costs you real money, potentially, or maybe you can't sell and kills the deal. So the ownership is big, especially a lot of Greg was talking about off-the-shelf stuff. Oh, it's great, it's free, it didn't cost us anything, right? Well, no, you don't really own it either. And so you're trying to sell a package to the buyer who thinks you own the whole thing, when you maybe only own very small parts of it, if at all, and it's all off-the-shelf stuff or it's other open source that you don't really have the right to transfer that ownership. So I think ownership in the early stage deal is a huge issue. You have two public companies, you never really worry about the ownership of the IP. It's all embedded. But the early stage M&A deals, ownership comes up, I say, half the time, because it's not clear the title, it's not clear that it's someone else doesn't have rights to it, and that's one of the big issues in early stage M&A that you don't typically see in traditional M&A.
One other comment to that is, people who I've spoken with who work at startups say, well, if my startup isn't successful, all of these legal ownership issues doesn't matter, right? Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. But if your startup is successful and you have this problem, it might also really matter. Right? So there's a time in the middle where, if you're at a startup, you're going to need to decide whether you should clean it up or whether you should look at it, right? And you're going to have to pick when is the right time. There's no magic about when that right time is, right? One thing that may come into play is, when VCs come in to invest, they may want some of these things cleaned up because they want to protect the money that they're investing in your company, right? So some of this stuff occurs kind of pre-VC funding, but when, top tier VCs come in, one of the things they usually do is look at what IP do you have, has it been protected, are there any other issues, and they often will want to clean up some of those things.
Mitch-san, would you like to have some comments on this topic? We've been discussing IP ownership as well as IP protection, and how much do you care about those things, IP from venture capitalist perspective?
So actually my answer is quite contradicting. Actually, I don't really care too much on IP. I do more on the earlier stage deal, which is more about the team and engineering, including engineering team, and it's more about the market opportunity in the future. So usually some of the deals we saw in terms of acquisition was not much about IP. It's much more about the engineering talents. So I think Chad was talking about before is what they are acquiring, right? If they are just acquiring the human being, it's just about $1 to $2 million per head. But a human as an engineer, and if the acquirer is acquiring for new business opportunity, that's a different story. I think that's where the IP and some other issue comes up. That's to me is much more a little bit more developed country. From me, that's the way I see it.
Chad-san, from a valuations perspective, would you like to add something?
So valuing IP is always one of the more interesting challenges, I'll say, because it requires talking to engineers, and engineers fall in love with their product. They don't even care about if anyone's going to pay for it. They just love the functionality of it. And so it's interesting. You go talk to them, and they throw out a number. I want to sell this for less than $100 million. That's it. That's their statement. And then you go talk to the business guys, right? And you say, hey, what's this technology worth? And like, no one wants it. I can't give this stuff away for free, right? And then you talk to maybe the people in the tax group who sort of are trying to do some tax advantageous planning, and so they come up with some way to sort of get money to cheaper tax jurisdictions, and so they come up with an input and say, well, it's somewhere in the middle. And so as a valuation practitioner, I'm pulling all this together and trying to craft a story with it. And it's interesting because this is all within, by the way, one company, right? I'm not talking about different companies. This is all one company who can't, with different specialties, it's difficult to get on the same page. So there is an art there, and at the end of the day, it's what's going to drive the value is it core to the product? Is it something you're selling, or is it sort of that sits on the outside? Are you able to monetize it through other ways? Right, and then what's the risk? Are you getting attacked by non-practicing entities who are constantly suing you for infringement, et cetera, et cetera? So it's one of the more challenging and interesting assets to value, but it takes sort of an averaging of everything you hear.
So before we move on to take questions, speakers, would you like to add something on the four topics or other topics, or can we move on to take questions?
For sure.
All right. Okay. So now we would like to welcome any questions from the audience. Those who have questions, please raise